E.J. Antoni is joining me today. He's an economist at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. E.J., thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Samantha, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Now, the 2020 census recently came out, and some Republicans have been expressing concern over the revised census numbers versus what we were expecting from the estimates. Can you just walk us through exactly what's happening and sort of break down what these concerns are?
Absolutely. So every year, the Census Bureau will provide estimates for the population changes within states. So what they do is they take the last census numbers, and then they try to incorporate things like international and domestic migration rates, birth and death rates, and then that will give an annual estimate up until the next census happens. So right before each census is released, they actually release the estimate of that same year. And the numbers are always off slightly because obviously it's a different methodology between the estimate and the actual census, but the numbers are usually fairly close. So as context, in the last census, all of the states were within about 0.4% of their estimate. So pretty close. This time around, we had two states that were a tenfold increase in terms of their margin of error. So you actually had only 7 states that fit into the last census's margin of error. So there was quite a bit of discrepancy. Another issue is the fact that the states that tended to gain large amounts of population tended to be blue states, and the states that lost large populations tended to be red states. So that's raising some red flags for some Republican lawmakers.
And how could that even happen? I mean, in terms of just logistically speaking, when the census comes, you fill it out. I mean, how could the numbers be so off in terms of what we are, supposedly seeing with the estimates versus what actually happened with the census?
Well, it certainly raises red flags, but the reason that there is some discrepancy again is because there's a difference in the methodology. The annual estimates are not a true census. That's only done once every 10 years, according to Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution. However, again, it is very, very odd that you would see such large disparities and that you would see them pattern out according to political ideologies in these different states. For example, you had, again, New York and New Jersey, which with very large margins of error. New York over 4.5%, New Jersey over 4.6%. You saw not as large, but again, similar increases in other blue states like Illinois, Massachusetts as well. Meanwhile, if you look at many red states like Arizona, the great state of Texas, Florida, both North and South Carolina, you saw large decreases. Arizona was over 3.5% off, but negative, whereas the blue states, again, were positive. So Arizona lost over 250,000 people. New York was nearly 880,000 people to the good. And New Jersey was about 412,000 positive as well.
So I just want to reference a letter that was sent by a few Republicans that was sent to the U.S. Department of Commerce, and they note that their staff had contacted the Census Bureau with questions, and then they were referred back to the White House. What is that all about? And does that also raise flags, or is that sort of normal to see?
I think the Census Bureau definitely owes Congress, and therefore the American people, an explanation as to these disparities. Again, maybe there was something nefarious going on. Maybe there wasn't. Perhaps the 2010 census was just abnormally accurate and the 2020 census was abnormally inaccurate. I know some other people have raised concerns that because of all the other issues going on in 2020, that is what caused problems with the census. It just seems very odd that you would see any kind of patterns along political ideology in the different states. So I think it does make sense that the Census Bureau owes some kind of explanation as to why these patterns have emerged.
Now, obviously, the census has political ramifications in terms of, representatives for each state, as well as a monetary benefit for these states. So with that in mind, Republicans obviously have these concerns. Is there any way to challenge the census? I mean, where does the process go from here?
Well, I'm an economist by trade, and while I've wandered into the legal field sometimes, I think this might be a little out of my wheelhouse to say exactly
Mhm.
what you can do to remedy the census if we do in fact find that there were some errors for whatever reason. But to your point, Samantha, on the
Mhm.
political ramification, you had New York losing one seat instead of two. You had Rhode Island not losing any seats instead of a seat. Arizona gained no seats instead of picking up one. You had Florida only picking up one instead of two, and Texas only picking up two instead of three. So there are absolutely political ramifications for the census, as well as issues of the apportionment of federal dollars as well.
And I think my home state of Pennsylvania, I also think lost a seat. So definitely, I believe it's the Rust Belt states. We saw sort of a decrease with those seats. And then, like you said, Texas and Florida gaining seats. But as you just mentioned, not as many as were expected. Now, some on the left were very critical of President Trump and his handling of the census. I have this Politico article that I just want to reference and sort of, break down with you, get your thoughts on. Now, this Politico article reads that an estimated 60 million American households had yet to be counted when the Trump administration decided that, against the wishes of demographers in the Census Bureau, it would slash a full month from the typical 2+ months allotted to following up with households that didn't respond. And then also they talk about, the continued effort by the administration to come up with a separate count of undocumented immigrants. One last thing, they talk about the first time the census is integrating online collected data in addition to the in-person count. So obviously 2020 was really unprecedented in a lot of ways. Is there any truth or any value to what the Trump administration reportedly did, according to this Political article, in terms of affecting the census count?
Well, if there is, again, I see no reason why the effects would be broken down in such an observable pattern according to political ideology within the states.
Mm.
So could there have been some effect from those things? Possibly. Although, speaking of making the transition from paper to digital, I would expect that would increase and not decrease the accuracy of the count in many of these states. The fact that you have a state like New York, which all of a sudden increases its population by over 800,000 is pretty striking, right? And you mentioned the Rust Belt states, like in Pennsylvania, my home state as well. And what you find is that these decreases in population are simply a continuation of a trend. And that's part of what makes this census adjustment so odd, is that many of the adjustments that were made from the estimate to the actual census show a complete reversal of the existing trend that has been going on for 10 or 20 years in many of these cases. One other thing I'll say about the 2010 census, almost every single state was revised the same way, down, which again stands in stark contrast from the 2020 census.
So if there is sort of like a political influence behind it, I mean, obviously, people work to pull strings behind the scenes in terms of like gerrymandering. If this was something like this was happening in terms of like influencing the census, in terms of like getting more people in your district, or like your population increasing, how exactly would Republicans be able to prove this? I know you touched a little bit on this earlier, but in terms of like, I guess, how would they go about that?
That's a very good question, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to punt on that one. That's another one that might be a little out of my wheelhouse. I'm not sure exactly what recourse they would have to, number one, prove how exactly the census was conducted and if it was conducted appropriately. And then once that judgment can be made, then to try to essentially fix the problem if they can determine that there in fact was anything nefarious going on in the first place.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know either. So I guess we'll have to see, how it plays out. And like we said, there's political ramifications associated with this as well as monetary. So EJ, Antoni, I so appreciate you coming on to talk about this. So much to break down with the census. So thank you so much. And, I hope you'll join me again soon in the future.
It'd be my pleasure. Thank you again, Samantha.